What's up, Flannelverse and Endgamers? This is Monday Night Football Talk. Texans at Cowboys for DraftKings Showdown. I am Neil Orfield. I'm here with Adam ShipMyMoney, Scherer. We're going to be going position by position: quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defenses, and kickers. We won't be taking questions at the end, but you can ask questions throughout if you have them. Adam, how I listened to your stream just before this with James McCool, but can you tell people how did yesterday go for you overall?
Not great. Lost like 50%, which is going to be your kind of average outcome. But it was a frustrating slate because like I thought in the notes article that I wrote for my Dub Club subs and Endgame subs, I thought that a lot of the stuff that actually stood out to me that I highlighted from just a pretending like I know football standpoint actually like worked out or happened or whatever. Like I thought that, Taysom Hill looked more interesting than usual. I really liked Jameson Williams more than usual. I liked Tyreek Hill more than usual. Like a lot of stuff kind of worked out, but then it was just like I didn't have it in the right lineups or whatever. So yeah, I don't know. It was frustrating. I said on the show with James, I think like I thought that slate in general was fun from a strategy standpoint and a lineup building standpoint. And I feel like if you could just like play that slate 100,000 times, I'd have made a good amount of money. It's always I hate the slates obviously unless like you jam the guy, but the slate where like you have one or two guys score a ridiculous number of points and like you have to have them to win, I'd rather just be like, oh, a bunch of players scored 30 to 35 and did really well and you can win in a variety of different ways. Then yeah, you can play really well overall, but if you don't have Taysom Hill paired with Amon-Ra St. Brown, you are drawing dead.
Yeah, I'm with you. That is my least favorite type of slate, obviously, like you said, unless you have the guy. Happens in NBA all the time where it's like, okay, I feel like I nailed like all these low owned plays, and then just like the chalk guy goes completely off, or just like one player who I have some of, but not necessarily in the right lineups goes completely off.
It doesn't even have to be like the chalk guy. Like yesterday, Brock Bowers, great play. Obviously, like scores a bunch of points from at least an optimal standpoint. Not saying you couldn't have won with him because you're not making the optimal, but like from an optimal standpoint, terrible play because Jonnu Smith matched him and Taysom Hill beat him at the same position.
Yeah, exactly. I sort of felt saved by the Taysom thing from being concerned about the fact. So I built a lineup for my the 555. I built out a hand built a lineup, and I was like, okay, this is gonna be my lineup, and it was Jameis Winston with Jerry Jeudy and David Njoku, and had some nice pieces around it. Would have done pretty well, but for a while I was like, holy shit. But I didn't end up playing that one. I pivoted to a Tua double stack, actually triple stack, Tua triple stack with Devin Achane, Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Waddle. I was like, I could totally see this game, like this being the game that they come out of nowhere and shock the world. So I ended up going with that instead. And for a while I was like, holy fuck, did I just cost myself $1 million? So I didn't come close to the lineup that I built. I did play in the $20. But I, for a while, was like sweating that until Taysom went completely off, and I was like, okay, I didn't have Taysom in that lineup, so I would have been toast anyway. But yeah, that was frustrating. I also only ended up with 1% Taysom Hill after every show I did. I was like, I brought him up as a play, like, oh yeah, Taysom Hill clearly in play, like he runs, he does all this stuff. He's hard to project, but like he's very much in play. And then ended up with just 1% because I did what I usually do. I didn't give myself enough time to build lineups because I was busy with the Roto-Grinder show with TJ. What's up, TJ? But I loved Jerry Jeudy. I loved Dave Montgomery. So early on, I was looking like, oh my God, everybody that I loved is crushing. And I like didn't get to nearly as much as I wanted to of these players. So I was kind of relieved that Taysom went off, and he was never going to be like somebody I wanted to be double the field. It was like, yeah, he's a solid play. I probably want to get to 5-10% like what the field is getting to. So yeah, I guess I was kind of saved by that.
Yeah, it was. I felt like that was just like the slate in general. There was a lot of just like, oh, this guy looks good, but then like they're still just difficult to get to for a variety of reasons. In Taysom's case, it was that he's still twice as expensive, or 1.5 times as expensive as the value tight ends, and he is priced relatively closely to like Kelsey and Bowers, and just tough to get in.
Yeah, exactly. What's up, Andy? TJ, man, close to winning the Millie if he had just played Amon-Ra St. Brown over McCaffrey. That's brutal. All right. We're going to go position by position while you are coming in. If you are not already subscribed to both of our YouTube channels, we would appreciate Adam and I both trying to grow brand new channels on YouTube, new this year. I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers by the end of the NFL season. Adam does a lot of great NBA content over at Endgame Syndicate. So yeah, if you could sign up for the Flannelverse and Endgame Syndicate, we would of course be appreciative. Adam, how is the NBA stuff going so far?
Going pretty well. I've only done a couple of shows, but trying to get into that more consistently. I keep kind of just like not giving myself enough time to get all of my projections done before the show. But yeah, doing that today at 4:30, and the first couple shows I've done have gone well. I think it's a good way to talk through slates and also look at how things are shaping up for me. Also allows me to personally catch maybe some mistakes that I'm making early in the day instead of finding out after lock.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we'll start with quarterbacks. CJ Stroud and Cooper Rush are the quarterbacks today. CJ Stroud obviously projecting better than Rush. Stroud projecting for 7.5% ownership in the captain spot. We'll start with the Stroud side of things. 7.5% in the captain spot. Oh God, my mouse is frozen. Adam, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's literally just my mouse apparently. All right, let me see if I can. Huh. I'm stuck on this screen. I'm glad. Maybe give me 1 second. I might have 2 batteries here that work. I think my mouse literally just ran out of batteries just now. So, and I can't move this around without the mouse. So, the one downside to a wireless mouse.
Are you on a desktop, I assume?
I am. Okay, good. It was just that. that was bad timing right when we started the show. All right, so let me. Okay. So we have CJ Stroud, literally my last 2, by the way, AAA batteries right here.
Nice.
CJ Stroud at 7.5% captain ownership, coming in at 43.5% flex ownership. That seems both those numbers seem pretty fair to me. I think I actually like those numbers, just given that he's the clear better quarterback option on this slate. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I think they both look pretty good. I have them projected for like 11% captain ownership right now, which I think is a little bit low. 9,800 is a pretty cheap price tag. I do obviously understand the game script arguments where Stroud may not need to throw all that much because the Cowboys suck. And then also Stroud doesn't really run, and he hasn't been particularly great from a fantasy standpoint this year. But I still think 10% maybe a little bit low. He's showing up optimal like 14, 15% for me. But I think the flex ownership around 54, 55% looks fine. And maybe that captain optimal percentage does end up coming down a little bit. But I think it's being pushed up probably by the fact that like there's not a lot of high scoring pieces in this game from a projection standpoint. Like, I don't think this is super likely to be a game where you need CJ Stroud to score 40 fantasy points to be the optimal captain. As long as Mixon and Collins kind of stay out of the end zone multiple times, I think it's conceivable that Stroud just kind of has an average-ish game and still ends up at captain because it's so likely that the Cowboys collectively suck and raw points from CJ Stroud just kind of get you there.
Yeah, I think it looks great. You have him at pretty significantly higher ownership than Rotogrinders has, and you still think he's low. So Rotogrinders has him at just 7.5% projected ownership at captain. You have them at 10% and think that's too low. So 7.5% would be kind of a smash, it sounds like.
Yeah. And again, like maybe my numbers come down, maybe Rotogrinders comes up. Usually they kind of converge by the time we get closer to lock.
True. Looks like a really strong play at Rotogrinders numbers. You do have them a little bit higher, so it's a little bit tougher, but yeah, very strong play as the clear top quarterback on the slate. He's the easy one to break down, and of course doesn't run a lot. So if I play CJ Stroud, I want him to always be paired with at least one pass catcher. If I have him a captain, I think I want him with 2 pass catchers. Can you tell by your sims, like who are you getting to the most when you have CJ Stroud at captain?
Yeah, so when he is at captain, I'm getting Nico Collins in 61% of the lineups, Tank Dell in 50%, Mixon in 46%. Then there's kind of like a tier break, and you start getting into the other guys: Jake Ferguson, CeeDee Lamb, John Mechie, Dalton Schultz, Rico Dowdle, Cooper Rush, all like 24 to 34%. And then there's another tier break to everybody else.
Okay. So yeah, sounds like you're mostly getting to a lot of Texans receivers, kind of as expected.
Yeah. Kind of just like scrolling through the lineups too. It looks like a decent amount of, double stacking. So 5-1 Houston, Dallas, 5-1 Houston, Dallas. Here is a Stroud, Stover, Nico, Dell lineup, Stroud, Nico, Dell kicker lineup. So yeah, a lot of double stacking and onslaughts when he's a captain.
Yep. On the other side, we have Cooper Rush, who only projecting for 12.6 fantasy points. He is projected for 33% ownership in the flex. At captain, we have Cooper Rush coming in at 5% ownership. I wouldn't even be surprised to see those numbers come in lighter than they're projected for, because nobody really wants to play Cooper Rush. What do you have the projected ownership at for Cooper Rush, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I have 31% projected at flex, 2.5 or 3% projected at captain. I think that the flex ownership's a little bit low. Like, he showed up optimal 34% in the flex for me compared to 31. Showed up optimal at captain about 2% of the time. So not a big Cooper Rush at captain fan. I think at flex he looks fine. Like, you're not expecting a lot from him, but the other thing you have to keep in mind is that he is because he's correlated to his teammates. If a lot of the times that Cooper Rush sucks, his team, like the whole team sucks. Yeah. So it's not like there's a lot of times, obviously you could just get guys getting there because of they catch passes, and that doesn't do a lot for Cooper Rush. Or Rico Dowdle happens to have a good game on the ground, and that doesn't help Rush. But like, there's not a lot of outcomes where multiple Dallas guys do well and Cooper Rush isn't at least serviceable at 8K. And so that does still drive up his optimal percentage a decent amount, even though he doesn't project that well and he's not any good.
Yeah. So I have the notes I took on Cooper Rush. So last week, passed for 45 yards and lost 2 fumbles. So I had negative fantasy points last week. He did start 5 games early in 2022, and he in those games averaged 11.16 fantasy points per game. So he serviceable in those games. The projection, he's projected slightly better than that. Looks fine. Probably needs to pass to keep up with the Texans. Texans defense has allowed the 9th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. I didn't say it when we were doing the CJ Stroud bit, but the Cowboys defense has allowed the 5th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So kind of a nice spot for both quarterbacks, at least from a schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed perspective.
The one downside for Dallas, a lot of that has been rushing. They've allowed the second most schedule adjusted rushing points to quarterbacks. They've still been a favorable matchup passing, but not as favorable.
Yep, that's true. I think still when you sort by passing, they're still
they're like top 10.
Yeah. So still it's a nice spot for both quarterbacks, but that is a good note. With Cooper Rush, it's a little bit of a different equation because he's pretty cheap. So like I always want him stacked. So that still, I think, holds on this slate. I think I always want him stacked even in the flex. But at captain, usually I usually say with a non-rushing quarterback like Cooper Rush, I want to have multiple pass catchers in the flex when I have him at captain. It sounds like you don't really want to play Cooper Rush at captain anyway, but I would say like you could, I think, loosen up the rules a little bit because he's 8,000. So it is possible for him to just like feed it to CeeDee Lamb in particular, and he's still the optimal captain instead of Lamb because he's so much cheaper than Lamb. So I think that's more viable. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, most of the Cooper Rush captain lineups are still, him with several other Cowboys, because the better he plays, the more the Cowboys offense is doing, probably in general, the more scoring they're doing. So it is going to pull up other guys. But I do agree with you because what you were saying, because like, one, you have a clear alpha receiver in CeeDee Lamb, and then a bunch of other just random dudes that who knows how they're going to do.
Right.
But then you also get the pricing gap where, obviously if like Lamb goes for 103 touchdowns and 10 catches, he's the optimal captain regardless of price. But there is a pretty nice window where like CeeDee Lamb has a good game, he's optimal, but because of the pricing difference and what you're able to get, around him, Cooper Rush ends up being the optimal captain, and it's Lamb at flex. So, I do think Rush plus Lamb and nothing else from Dallas is perfectly fine.
Yeah, it's like you don't see it that often because usually you have like the quarterback and the top receiver are going to be similar in price, and it's like, so if he's feeding that wide receiver too much, then the receiver is going to be optimal captain instead of the quarterback. But here it's like Lamb could outscore Cooper Rush and still not be the optimal captain because of the pricing dynamics. So it's more viable, but like you said, like you're still seeing mostly multi-stacked when you have him at captain. Or maybe, I don't know if you can tell this, but are you getting to any of him naked in the flex? I don't think I would want to, but he's cheap enough that it's like worth asking the question. I don't know if you can really tell quickly.
I think it would be fine, just because he is cheap, but mostly he's at least somewhat stacked. So like here's one, like it's him, the Cowboys kicker. Oh, sorry, that's Lamb at captain, so he's still stacked.
It's probably not the best because he doesn't run at all, and it's like seems unlikely for him to get there.
He's pretty much always stacked with somebody in some way.
Okay, yeah, just I thought it was an interesting conversation because of the pricing dynamics being different.
Here's one where he's with Cowboys defense and both running backs.
Okay,
and
interesting.
No pass catchers. But like that's still the Cowboys. It's still stacked with the Cowboys offense. Just not the receivers.
Okay. Any other notes on Cooper Rush or either quarterback?
No.
All right, move on and talk about the.
Oh, are you playing any Trey Lance?
Any who?
Trey Lance.
I had not given that any thought. Maybe. I guess that's let's talk about it. Are you going to play any Trey Lance? That's sort of interesting.
I don't think so, but I mean, you can make the case. Like he's 6K, so if Cooper Rush gets benched at halftime, that means like you assume taking injury out of it. If Cooper Rush were to get benched at halftime, that probably means that every player on the Cowboys was doing terribly.
Yeah.
And so half of the game at that point is basically drawing dead to be optimal, other than like you have to roster somebody from the Cowboys. Right. So like if Trey Lance comes in for the second half at 6K and plays functionally well, because you're assuming everybody else to that point on the Cowboys wasn't doing anything, he pretty clearly has a path to being optimal.
I mean, he's a running quarterback who is 6,000. Yeah, if he plays half the game and nobody has him, I would think that's an interesting play. Yeah, that was worth bringing up. But yeah, I have not given any thought to Trey Lance. Jerome says that's very high risk. Yeah, I mean, the risk is like most of the time he's going to get a 0. So like It is the ultimate high risk, but also high reward. So it's like the total, like he's probably going to get 0. Like probably, what do you say, 95% of the time it's going to be 0 from Trey Lance. Do you think it's less than that?
So 0, I think, is less because I think that there's a chunk of the time where he just has like a package around the goal line or something. The percentage of the time that he remotely sniffs being optimal is probably less than 5%.
Yeah, but he's also going to be owned at less than 5%. So that's why it's like for the largest field GPP is worth a conversation. Probably not playing him in anything other than the largest field GPPs. But yeah,
I mean, like I have at least like a one. Like I have an actual projection on him, greater than 0, but it's not nearly enough to get him into lineups at 6K. So, if you are using optimizers, sims, whatever, you're never going to get him unless you consciously make the decision to like, hey, I'm going to play a subset of lineups that have Trey Lance.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting like conversation from a game theory perspective. Yeah, but obviously not getting there based on any kind of projection. Yeah, I'll have to think about that a little bit more because it's never worked out for me when I play the backup quarterback. Like there have been times where it's like, oh, there's a little bit of benching risk here, and you can kind of make a case for it. I'll have a package here or there. Even like there was a Russell Wilson was going to start, but Justin Fields will still see some action on a showdown slate, and then Justin Fields just didn't play at all.
That was a little bit different just because like it was similar in that you had the chance that Fields was going to have some plays, but they were starting Russell Wilson over Justin Fields, making that change. It wasn't super likely that 5 series in, they're going to be like, we're going back to Justin Fields. So like here, there's a pretty decent chance that they watch 2 more quarters of Cooper Rush and just go like, we can't do this shit anymore.
Yeah. I think that I've been missing some like YouTube chat for some reason today. I was watching your stream earlier with James, and although I'm in stream mode, so you'd think I'd be able to see it. I don't know what's going on, but earlier I was watching that stream, and James was bringing up comments that I couldn't see anywhere, and now I feel like Jerome is responding to something that was said in chat. He says, "Me either. I'm good."
Yes,
Maybe he was
can't
responding to
see it.
something we said. I don't know. So I don't know if I'm missing something, but hopefully I'm not missing YouTube comments based on, I don't know, this morning.
Did your
Anyway,
moderator like kick you out of your chat?
yeah, maybe. All right. We'll move on to running backs. Joe Mixon, the very clear top running back on the slate, projecting for 21.5 fantasy points at fantasy points. At Roto Grinders, projecting for 23 fantasy points. Man, massive projection on Joe Mixon. He's going to get 43% ownership in the flex. At captain, we have Joe Mixon coming in at 26% ownership. So that's where all the ownership is going. How do you feel about those numbers, Adam?
I think he's going over owned, but I think he's very obviously a clearly good play. Like he's the highest projected guy on the slate. The most likely game script favors him, where Dallas just can't do anything and Houston doesn't really need to throw the ball. So he looks really good. He's very likely to succeed. I do think that, again, he's going a little bit over owned. I have him optimal in the flex like 43% of the time, optimal at captain like 16%. Again, I think maybe that comes up a little bit and Stroud comes down. Like if I am a little bit high on Stroud right now, that would naturally cut into Mixon and make me a little bit low on Mixon. But obviously looks very, very good. It's really just an ownership question.
Yep, it is let's see, in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, it is a top 10 matchup against the Cowboys. Let's see, what are the notes I took on Mixon? Ninth most schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed per game. He has 151 carries and 23 targets in 7 games. Just awesome role, awesome game script. You'd expect them to be playing with the lead. Like everything looks great for Mixon. Like you said, looks like slightly overowned, but not in a massive way. Going to be obviously a big part of a lot of our game plans today. I mean, at captain, he looks a little bit overowned at 26%. I wouldn't even say he looks overowned at flex here, where he's projected for 43% ownership. What do you have the optimal rate at in the flex?
43 flex, 16 captain.
Okay.
Captain probably should be a little bit higher.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. And then outside of, we'll finish off the Texans part of the game. We have Daria Gumbawale projected for 3.1 fantasy points at 3,000. JJ Taylor 1.1 fantasy points at 800. I kind of always like backup running backs to an extent, just because they have massive contingent upside. Agumbawale, let's see, let me sort by week here. Last week, Daria Agumbawale, just 1 carry. He had been trending, 50% route participation, 3 targets in that game for Agumbawale. The game prior to that, just 12.8% route participation and 1 target. The role has been kind of all over the place for Agumbawale. Man, so last week was, am I sorted right? I thought he'd been trending up. It looks like I am. Well, let's start with Agumbawale. What is your level of interest there?
Not a ton. He's showing up optimal like 5% of the time, fields at 5%. I think he's just kind of your normal backup running back. The case you could, I guess, make in some builds, again, this is just, normally we don't get into game scripts too much on this show, but this is such a potentially weird game. If Houston's winning by $1 billion at the end of the third quarter, who's getting carried? Like, is it Agumbawale? Is it Taylor? Is it somebody that I don't even know is on the team? There is that kind of route to getting maybe some late value from a backup running back here if they just take Mixon off the field at some point because of the score. So like in lineups like that, you would, I guess, like either of the backup running backs for Houston maybe have a little bit more correlation with their teammates than usual, where like if you play a 5-1 Houston stack, they make some sense just hoping they get fourth quarter carries because they're winning by a lot.
It is worth noting that Pierce is expected to play tonight. So we don't know for sure, but Dameon Pierce is expected to play tonight. So those are so that probably takes away from interest in Agumbawale, where is Pierce's? Pierce projected, so he's 2.4 thousand, projected for about 4% ownership. I think I agree with chat that Pierce is probably the backup running back that we would have the most interest in here. Are you getting to much Pierce?
Not right now, but I think the same thing I was just saying applies.
Yeah.
And I think Pierce in the blowout, I agree that Pierce in the blowout makes
Yeah.
the most sense, assuming he's active. Like Agumbawale, I assume, is still getting, still running routes, but like
Yep.
that's not likely to be a super valuable role if your team is winning by 100. So, I assume that if they're up by 40, you're probably just getting some like Dameon Pierce carries.
Yep. Makes sense. All right. The other side, we have Rico Dowdle is 9,000, projected for 12.4 fantasy points. Let's start with just the Dowdle side of it. 33% projected ownership in the flex. At captain, Rico Dowdle projected for about 8% ownership. There's been some positive coach speak for Dowdle. So my notes on him were over the past 2 weeks, 24 carries on 4 and 9 targets. So he's been targeted, 4.5 times per game, 12 carries per game just over the past couple weeks. So a solid, not like spectacular role. But per the Coach Speak Index Discord, head coach Mike McCarthy said this week of Dowdle, you got to get him the ball. That's my focus. Just continue to get him opportunities. He's the lead back. Rico needs to touch the ball. So some positives, Coach Speak. However, the Texans defense has allowed the 6th fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs. So I think the role looks solid, and maybe they just want to run the ball more now with Cooper Rush at quarterback. But it is a tough matchup, and they might not the ball. So I don't know if it all comes out in the wash. Adam, how are you feeling about Rico Dowdle today?
Yeah, I think he's going a little bit overowned, but I still think he looks okay. I don't love the 9K price tag. Like he's $400 less than Tank Dell. He's $800 less than CJ Stroud. He's not, that much less than even like Nico. So that's kind of a concern. But yeah, I think everybody's going to focus on the fact that the Cowboys might get their asses kicked and not run a lot. But to your point, when you have somebody like Cooper Rush at quarterback, you're likely to want to limit the opposing team's possessions and kind of drag your drives out as long as you can. You're going to potentially get a larger pie for rushing attempts. And if Dowdle also is taking on a bigger percentage of that, then they could just be putting the ball in his hands a lot. So efficiency likely to be an issue because, the offense isn't very good, but he should get plenty of opportunities.
Yeah. So I don't know, 33% flex. He's 9,000. That seems like fine, not like a priority for me, but like a totally fine number. 8% at captain. I don't know. I don't really have any issue with either of those numbers. They both seem about right to me. Are you? Somebody brought up on my show, Adam, last night, and somebody had actually brought this up about you in my comments previously. People were so somebody said yesterday, like, Neil likes everybody because he plays 150 lineups. And somebody had said something similar about you, like, oh, I can never tell, who Adam really likes and who he doesn't like. And I feel like a lot of the time it's like, if I don't feel strongly about a player, I end up just being like, yep, I'll probably try to match the field. Like that's kind of like if I think the field is playing it right, and that's happening a lot these days because the field's gotten really sharp, as you were saying on your show earlier. It's like, yeah, I think the field is really sharp, and a lot of the time they're just going to be right on players. And when the field I think is getting it right, then I want to match the field on players. That's how I feel about Rico Dowdle today. I guess is why I'm bringing this up right now. But how do you deal with that when you think the field is playing sharply for the most part? How do you adjust your process as far as like how much you want to get to various players?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like for me, it's not wanting to get to anything. Like, I don't care what I play, how much I play of anybody. And so, like, that's kind of the thing. Like, it's tough to do. It's kind of the disconnect, and you try and bridge it as best you can. But like, the disconnect between watching a show like this and then actually playing DFS is I don't like or dislike any player or want to get to any specific amount of any player. It's all based on what I'm expecting the field to do and then adjusting to that. And so generally, I think the field is going to play pretty efficiently because the field is at this point pretty good. And so for the most part, you're just going to get like, yeah, I probably, I think the field is correct because the field's using good data and they're making good lineups. Dowdle, in this case for me, I think is projected to go a little bit overowned, but he's still likely to be one of the most, he's still got one of the highest optimal rates. So like that's the issue you run into in Showdown too. Like on a main slate, if I'm looking at somebody and saying, I think the field's playing him at too high of a rate, there's a million different options that I can play that are low owned. And that's where you start to get contrarian. On a Showdown slate, I can think the field is playing too much Rico Dowdle, but there's only so much I can do because I have two teams to choose from. So, that's kind of what it is. But yeah, generally my exposures just naturally through my process are going to individual player exposures are going to be pretty close to the field in a lot of cases. A lot of times in Showdown, the biggest gaps for me are going to be on the really, really cheap guys that are 1-2% owned. And I'm just mixing them into a bunch of different lineups. So I'm higher than the field there. But it's not that I like Ryan Flournoy or somebody. It's that
Right.
I am just playing, lineups that have different combinations of Mixon, Stroud, Collins, Lamb, Dell, whatever, and then hoping that he catches two passes and is the guy you need. So, yeah, it's always tough to like articulate that, especially again on a Showdown show.
Yeah. And I feel like you and I, we both try to do our best, and it's kind of like, but when I say like, my way of saying that I like a player is like, I plan to be overweight to the field on this player. It's not like, most of the time it's not like, oh yeah, this is just a jam spot. It's more like, I think the field is a little bit underweight where I think they should be on this player. So I am going to be overweight to the field.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. Like, it's all relative to the field. Like,
yeah,
I really like Nico Collins here, but if the field plays him, if I think the field's going to play him at 80%, I'm not playing Nico Collins, like barely
right.
ever. So everything's just relative to what the field is doing.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so I think that I do, particularly on Showdown, I do try to find a few individual plays that it's like, okay, this is a spot where I think I'm going to be at least double the field, or sometimes like triple, quadruple the field. But it's like, I want the players that I choose. I want those to be the players who make or break my slate. So I want to basically, I often try, and I think I probably focus on individual players more than you do. Like you're very focused on the lineups, and obviously I'm trying to get to good lineups, but like I want to get to a lot of good lineups with, like last night it was Jermaine Burton. Like I want to be well over the field on Jermaine Burton. So I want those players to make or break my night, like the players that I feel strongly about. But a lot of it is just like, okay, I think the field has this about right. So I'll try to match the field as best I can with the plays that I don't feel like the field is far off. Is kind of my approach to Showdown, I'd say.
And my counterpoint would be if you feel strongly about a guy who slows down his route every time a ball comes near him and can't catch it, you should maybe stop feeling strongly about things.
I mean, okay, that's one example. I feel like that was such a sharp play. Like after seeing the usage, if you just like saw, okay, here is where Jermaine Burton was targeted. Here are all of his targets for the game. Like you would have jammed him at 2.5% projected.
Oh yeah,
like Jermaine Burton versus Andre Yoshivas last night was like, oh my God, Jermaine Burton was such a better play than Andre Yoshivas. And of course, Yoshivas actually caught his balls and Jermaine Burton looked like trash.
Yeah.
So yes.
I'm not a film guy. Obviously, like I don't know what I'm watching if I watch, NFL stuff. But even like my big takeaway last night was like the whole Burton thing is super, super, the scouting report, super, super talented wide receiver, off the field issues. And then I'm watching him play. I'm like, is he even a good receiver? Like he gets open deep and just like slows up his route and misses the Burrow pass by like a yard. He's just like always a step behind where he should be to make big plays. It's like, is he even actually good?
Short pass in the end zone last night, and it was like he might have been like, maybe he was using his other arm, or like his other arm being held or something, but it was like, reach for two hands for it. Like
right.
don't just try to make a one-handed grab on that ball.
Yeah, it was just consistently like one step slow or behind.
Yeah.
They're just like not there.
Yeah, I also have a ton of him in best ball, by the way. So it was kind of painful to watch him. Like, okay, he looks like they want to get him involved. Like, I feel like my take was right from the perspective of like they are trying to get him the ball. Like he does still have a role, and nobody's projecting him for anything. But he just looked bad. That was frustrating. Anyway, this was not supposed to be about Jermaine Burton, but yeah, just as an example of like, okay, I feel like the field is playing this wrong. Like he's projected like he doesn't have a role, and I think he's going to still have a role, and he did still have a role. So I try to find a few of those and then just kind of match the field elsewhere. We'll bring it back to running backs. Rico Dowdle, I think the field has it about right. Probably not going to be a player that I try to make or break my slate with.
And that's a good way of putting it too, I guess, to like kind of wrap up what we were talking about. Like for me to say like I like a player or something, it's going to be that I think the input projections are wrong.
Yeah,
for the field. For somebody, like Nico Collins, CeeDee Lamb, Joe Mixon, like, yeah, I agree with the industry that they're going to be the number one wide receiver and number one running back. And there's not a lot I can add to that. If, maybe the word like would be way too strong. Can I make a case for like maybe Deuce Vaughn should be projected a little bit higher? Sure. and that would, I guess, kind of make me like him at $400. But like, yeah, it's for me to like actually advocate for a player. It's going to be that I think the industry's input projections are wrong, not that like their outputs are wrong.
Yeah, exactly. The input volatility. If you just think that like they're being projected wrong, then obviously you're gonna really like those players. I think Rico Dowdle probably being projected about where he should be. Outside of Rico Dowdle, we have Hunter Lipke, Zeke Elliott.
Doubtful.
Zeke is doubtful. Okay, so that
doubtful.
Lipke's doubtful. Okay, yeah, good.
Which
good
I'm really
note
happy
there.
about because I've been jamming that guy every Dallas Showdown slate this year.
Me too, and he has not worked out. Like it's always so intriguing. It's like, oh, he's a little bit involved in the passing game. He would make sense as their goal line back. Like there's so much to like about him. So that is a good note that Lipke is projected to be out. Let's just go down. Let me find all the Dallas running backs outside of Dowdle in terms of projected ownership. Zeke being projected for about 15% ownership at 2,600. Okay, they still have Lipke in also. So let's start with Zeke. 2,600 being projected for about 15% ownership. If we look at it, not there. Last week, Zeke played 12 snaps, had 6 carries, 0 targets on 3 total routes. The week prior to that, Zeke had 10 carries. No, sorry, week 9. Did he was out week? Oh, he was out. That's right. He was a healthy scratch in week 9.
Yeah.
In week 8, Zeke had 10 carries and 1 target on 25% route participation. So it sounds like, all the coach speak kind of indicates that Rico Dowdle is going to be the lead back going forward. I think that the Delvin Cook experiment he's not even projected as far as I could see. So I think that experiment is over. Zeke is like, I think he's probably the back with the most contingent upside for the Cowboys, but not much of a role. I think he looks fine, but 15% feels a little bit high to me. How do you feel about Zeke?
Yeah, so this is one where I'm gonna have to kind of dig into it more throughout the day. Like using baseline stuff right now, one, I have his flex ownership way higher, but I think it's like too high. It's like 28%. I'm guessing that's an ETR thing. But he showed up optimal like 22%, which seems high, but like he is 2,600. They've shown, a willingness to use him around the goal line. I tend to not buy into anything coaches say ever. But in this case, it does logically match up. Everybody outside of the Dallas coaching staff has known all season long that they should be using Dowdle more and Zeke less. Maybe they're finally figuring it out. I have no idea. So like on the one hand, at 2,600, I think he's interesting if he's low owned. If he's going to be popular though, I don't like him. So, I think there's a chance here where he just like ends up not really being involved at all. Like they gave him, goal line or red zone touches last week and he coughed it up at the goal line. Then they went right back to him because Mike McCarthy is going to do Mike McCarthy stuff. But it's not like it's crazy to think maybe he just starts getting phased out of games and they go, Dowdle and anybody else. So I kind of just want to do the opposite of what the field's doing there. I think there's a lot of input volatility where if the whole industry just decides that Zeke is cooked and this is the week Dallas stops using him, I just want to play Zeke because it might not be. If they just say, they're going to keep using him a lot, then I would rather just be playing less. So I kind of just want to do the opposite of the field there because I have no idea. Neither does anybody doing industry projections.
Yeah. And you said that you have optimal like 20% of the time. So he looks a little bit low owned here, which, we talked about there could just be a bigger pie for the Dallas running backs because they have Cooper Rush at quarterback. They might not want to throw as much. So maybe I take it back. I was thinking 15% feels a little bit high given that he has not had a great role, but we could just see a game where they want to just run the whole game, not really try things with Cooper Rush as much. So maybe we just see a little bit more bigger pie overall for the Dallas backfield, and maybe he retains his role. So maybe he does get like 10 carries again, in which case probably looks okay. And we also they continue to just use him in the red zone when everybody's like, just use your best running back, like from the 2-yard line, just use Rico Dowdle. They continue to just give it to Zeke. He fumbled there in the last game, I believe. So yeah, maybe 15% is not actually high. Maybe it's actually low.
So I'm going to walk this back. I think it's It's correct. I just looked to see. I blamed it on ETR. It's not. SaberSim hasn't projected for 48% ownership when I looked at their stuff. That's not going to happen, and it's throwing that off completely.
All right. I'll touch on a couple questions here. Einstein asks, how do we feel about Rico in the captain spot? He's projected for about 8% ownership. I think that is about right. He says Dallas could have a quarterback-friendly game plan, controlling the clock, checkdowns, etc. I think he means running back friendly. But yeah, I think 8% feels about right. Is that about where you're at, Adam?
Sorry, I was checking ownership stuff. What was
Rico Dowdle at captain? How do you feel about it?
I have him optimal like 6%, ownership around 8.
Okay, so a little bit overowned. Orangutan Trade Salesman asks, do you tend to be higher on the field on low-owned guys or high-owned guys, or a bit of both, or does it depend? Really depends. Like it's very slate dependent. Sometimes there's like players who are getting 70% ownership, and I'm like, that's still too low. Like we had the week that Christian McCaffrey was ruled out just before the slate started, and suddenly Jordan Mason was going to be projected for like 40% ownership, and I was like, I think I'm going to have him in every lineup. So you get those sometimes, but it really depends on the slate. Do you have anything to add there, Adam?
Yeah, and it also depends kind of what the question you're asking. Like, I tend to have more of the higher owned players, but not necessarily. But like, also, I might be lower than the field by a bigger margin. Like, for example, on the main slate, like Cedric Tillman was one of my highest owned receivers, but I also only had half the field. So it depends if you're asking like relative to the field or total ownership. But especially in Showdown, like generally the more popular players, I'm going to have a lot of them too, because there's just not that many guys to choose from. But like also my biggest stands like relative to the field are going to be on low owned guys, because if I have 10% of them and they're 2% owned, I'm still 5x the field. Right. And like it's impossible to be 5x the field on CeeDee Lamb today.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So yeah, Zeke looks fine at about 15% ownership. Dowdle looks fine. These are not players that I'm taking any kind of stand on. Deuce Vaughn not being projected either of the sources that I'm using currently. Are you projecting? What do you say?
Because they're projecting Lipke in.
Yeah, exactly. So what are you seeing with Deuce Vaughn? I don't even know his price here.
He's $400, and right now I basically don't have a projection on him either. But I do think this is a spot where I'm going to end up projecting him a little bit higher. Either I'm going to end up projecting him a little bit higher than the field, or the industry is going to just adjust and we'll be in the same spot. I think that there's just multiple routes to him being involved. Like, this is assuming he gets elevated. Cook wasn't active last week. Maybe they elevate Cook and still not Vaughn. But assuming that Vaughn is active, like they can use him as a pass catcher. We've had Hunter Lipke running routes. That can be Deuce Vaughn. He has paths to garbage time run. You know, it would be really weird if Dallas is getting blown out for them to like give garbage time to Zeke or Dalvin Cook. Like, why wouldn't you just give it to Deuce Vaughn? So I think that there's a lot of ways actually for him to end up showing up as being a useful play. And my guess is that he ends up being my Hunter Lipke that I play like 40% of the time and he doesn't do shit.
Love it. I think that's a strong call. I do think it's obviously going to depend on what the field actually ends up getting to. Like if Deuce Vaughn ends up at like 20% ownership, then not feeling as good about it. But if he ends up at 2%, then yeah, he would be the Hunter Lipke, might be the Hunter Lipke play of the day. We'll see if he ends up there. But yeah, that's a interesting name to throw out there. Anything else at running back?
No.
Okay. Let's move on to wide receivers. Let me just check in on, we got a couple questions, comments in chat. Earth to Air to Billionaire said, I watched 3 different channels and they don't think Rush is going to finish the game. I think he's saying that he's going to go for the Trey Lance thing. So yeah, it's maybe not that uncommon, but I still think many play Trey Lance, right?
No, but I was thinking about it when we were talking about it, because we've talked about this before too. How pissed off you're going to be if like you take the Trey Lance approach and then he actually comes in and then you realize you're duped 20 times because like you played the best Trey Lance lineup.
Yeah,
and so did everybody else playing Trey Lance.
Yep, just like we saw with Tylan Wallace the other week, where it's like, oh, he ended up duped many times, even though he was completely unowned.
Also, one other, I guess, thing to point out with Lance, not that I think this is a super high probability you're good play or that I necessarily am even doing it, but Steven Leibowitz has said he thought it was a thin play for a very unproven QB versus this defense in a partial game. All that's true. It is obviously very thin play, but the one thing with Lance is that he will run. So it's much different, I think, than going with like a pocket passing quarterback, thinking he might play 2 quarters. If Lance plays 2 quarters, and again, if he's playing 2 quarters, chances are Dallas sucked for the first 2 and nobody really did anything. So the bar for being optimal is lower. He can get it done with his legs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think he's better than the typical backup quarterback. I'll be thinking about whether I want to get to some Trey Lance. Probably not a ton, but just throwing him in like a few lineups in a 150 set, I think makes some sense. Silas asks, is it worth it to throw 1 to 5 bullets in 150 maxes, or would you recommend playing single entry through max in these highly variable slates? I've always been okay with just playing however many lineups I'm going to play in a 150 set. I don't know if that's necessarily optimal, Adam, but I like to shoot for the big prizes. I think that's what I'm best at, is the largest field stuff. So I'm totally willing to just throw 5 bullets in a 150 set, because I think that's what I'm best at. How do you feel about, not maxing out in these 150 max contests?
I usually don't. It's something that I've kind of changed my opinion on over the years, because I think there's a variety of things. You touched on one. What you're good at. Like, I think I'm better at large field tournaments than small field. I think I could be very good at small field. I just haven't put as much time into it. So there's that. Like, if you think your game's more conducive to large field stuff, focus on those. Also, they're generally going to be softer fields. And so your money is just, you're going to have a higher expected return playing the softest fields that you can. And generally the softest field is going to be the one that has the lowest proportion of 150 max pro type players. So it's the smallest stakes you can find and the largest field typically. And then the other thing I think to keep in mind, and this is something that it took me years to kind of wrap my head around, you're playing against yourself in the sense that you're just trying to increase your bankroll. It doesn't matter to you if McLovin wins with his 149th lineup or whatever. If you have a higher expected ROI playing 5 lineups in a 150 max than 3 lineups and a 3 max, that's all that should matter to you. You're going to grow your bankroll better playing the higher ROI thing, even though, McLovin's playing 150 lineups. It doesn't actually impact you who wins those tournaments. So like, yeah, I'm fine. If you're good at 150 max, if you think you're better at 150 max, play your bullets in that. I don't really change I don't change the contests I play based on like quote unquote highly variable slates. Every slate has a ton of volatility.
Yeah, I don't really either. I don't think. But yeah, I guess my takeaway, and it sounds like you're on the same page, is totally fine if you want to play just a handful of lineups in a 150 set. That's usually what I do. I usually play I max out the 20 max. I'll play. I'm maxing out the mini max tonight, and then I'm playing like 10, 15 lineups in the $15 milli. So yeah, I think it's fine. CMOS says, I honestly feel like this slate you're going to have to max out salary. What are your thoughts? I haven't played with lineups. You feel the exact opposite. I haven't played around with lineups at all, so I don't really know. But you have played around with lineups, and you're getting to some good ones that are not maxing. Or
no, so I guess I'll walk that back. I haven't really looked at that, and I assume like from a projection standpoint, most of them are going to be near max especially because Mixon, Stroud, Collins, Lamb, it's just like such a strong tier, and then you have Dell, Dowdle. I was thinking more in the sense of like there are so many potential game scripts that not so many, but like it's relatively likely that you get the game script that elevates garbage time guys in the fourth quarter. Like this game more than a lot. It's just easy to envision Dallas not doing anything, and then somebody like Deuce Vaughn or Lance or a young wide receiver, whether that's like Mingo or Flournoy or something, like stepping up. And also the volatility here, like Jalen Tolbert, clearly the wide receiver 2 for Dallas, but it's not going to shock anybody if Jalen Brooks outscores him for 2,200 less. Like it strikes me as a slate where like more so than some others, because the mid range is so volatile, you could just see the winning lineup have 47K because a secondary wide receiver beat the guy that's priced ahead of him.
Yeah. Yep. We got a couple questions on one lineup versus 150, so I'm just going to touch on this real quick. Adam said, anyone ever make one lineup in cash, make 150 barely cash? Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a common thing. Yeah. Daniel said, I definitely need help or one extra step to solidify my 150 process. How do you get the bottom half non-cash to get chopped down? If you're cashing every one of your lineups, you're probably making too many similar lineups. Like you shouldn't be cashing all of your lineups on most slates, particularly for NFL. Like NBA, maybe you can if you have like a major projection edge or something, but I usually am not cashing a majority of my lineups. So I want to be clear about that. Like if you are 150 maxing, most of the time you probably are not going to be cashing more than half of your lineups, even if you're playing great. Would you agree with that? Do you have anything to add, Adam?
Yeah, in general. I mean, it's you always have to in DFS. You always have to like step back and keep in mind like what average is. Like if the cash line is 20% of the field or 25% of the field, you can be the best player in the world, and on average, you would expect to cash like 30% of your lineups or 33 or whatever. Obviously any given slate, and depending on your strategy and how concentrated you get, you're gonna get, the more concentrated you play, you're gonna have more slates where you cash 60% and where you cash 10%. Then if you diversify more, you're going to be, more around that middle mark. But it's more looking at the percentage, looking at the lineups that cash isn't really a good metric. I don't think you want to actually be going back and looking at the lineups that didn't cash or the lineups that did cash. Like, were they actually quality lineups that long term I would expect to be good? Or am I playing too many lineups that are just dog shit? Like, if the bottom 25% of my lineups all had 44K in salary and had 3 guys that project for like half a fantasy point, I need to figure out why I'm getting those lineups and make it stop. If I just didn't cash a bunch of lineups and they were all good lineups, I don't care.
Yeah, well said. All right, we've taken too many detours, so I'm seeing more questions, and maybe we'll get to them later. But I want to move on to wide receivers just because we're getting behind in time. Nico Collins, Adam projects the best on the slate. Of course, has a good quarterback on his side, so that's a bonus for the Houston guys. But projected for 38.5% ownership in the flex. At captain, we have Nico Collins coming in at 14% ownership. That seems like a pretty nice number there. 14% seems like a number I probably want to get on top of. What are you seeing with Nico Collins?
Yeah, I've at 16% captain and 19% captain optimal. So I think he's going on their own. I think it's pretty easy to like him. Like, he's clearly the number one receiver. He's really, really good. You can argue like him versus CeeDee Lamb just from a talent standpoint, I think. But then you can't argue that CJ Stroud's a hell of a lot better than Cooper Rush. And so Nico looks really, really good here, assuming that he's a full go. The price is fine. Like, he's 400 less than Lamb. He's only 600 more than Stroud. I think he looks really, really good. I am very happy to get to him, whether it's at flex or at captain, but I really like him as a captain.
Yeah, so we're on the same page. Just looks like a phenomenal play. I guess the biggest concern would be like if they get up by too much, maybe they stop throwing it in the second half, fourth quarter. You talked about this with James earlier, how it's like if you want to make the argument that like the Texans are going to get up too much, then it's probably because they scored a lot of points early on. So that does apply here, obviously. So it's kind of a give and take with if they're going to blow him out, like they'll pass less late, but they'll probably put up a lot of points early. Of course, the worst case scenario would be Joe Mixon puts up all those points early and then just continues to put up points. But still, Nico Collins just looks awesome because that's the worst case, not the most likely necessarily.
Right. Yeah. Like the nightmare scenario, if you have a lot of Nico, is that they score a lot of points early and it's Joe Mixon. But it's not even like a nightmare scenario if you're talking Nico captain, because once Joe Mixon has 2 or 3 touchdowns, Nico's not not the winning captain anyway. So who cares?
Right.
You're not like worried about that outcome. It's more, you shouldn't be overly concerned about the game script when you're talking about Houston being favored, because if the game is just a joke of a game by the fourth quarter, Houston probably scored a ton of points and Nico is as likely as anybody to have accounted for those points. And so outside of like, it's frustrating when you look at a really good team and it's like, oh, this team's great. It has Nico at captain with 50 points, but now he's not playing anymore. Like, that's frustrating, but there's no actual difference between him scoring 50 points spread out across 4 quarters and 50 points in 3 quarters. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well said. All right. Outside of Nico, we have Tank Dell projected for just 4% captain ownership. In the flex, we have Tank Dell projected for 24% ownership. Man, this is tough because he has not been that great this year, Adam. But like in theory, like there's no reason that he shouldn't just have the exact same role he had last year before they signed Stephon Diggs. I don't know if he is still dealing with some kind of injuries, things slowing him down. But he hasn't been nearly as good this year as he was last year. Still, these numbers stand out to me as like way too low. How do you feel about Tank Dell?
Yeah, I can't think of anything that happened in the offseason that could be slowing him down. But no, I mean, I still think he looks good. Same reasons you said. And like he has been unlucky this year too. Like just from not that I watch every game or anything close to it, but from the little bit I have seen, you've just seen drops on big plays, which I'm confident saying even if he lost the step getting shot in the leg, it's not affecting his
Right.
hands. You've seen, just he'll be wide open and Stroud misses him deep. Like there's been some bad luck there as well. And at 9,400, I think he looks okay. He's probably a little bit more expensive than he normally would be or should be just because of Nico being out and that price not completely adjusting back. But still on this slate looks good. Like you just don't have a lot of good skill position players on this slate. So he's the 5th highest projected guy for me behind Mixon, Stroud, Nico, Lamb. I think you can debate him versus Dowdle, but other than that, like he's kind of got to be a top 6 projection.
I just looked up yards per route run because I was just curious, like how much worse is he this year? And he's dropped from 2.4 yards per route run to 1.4 yards per route run. I keep on being like I'm hopeful that he is actually. Let me see if I can. Has it gotten any better? I guess this is also just a futile exercise because this is not futile exercise because it's been like Diggs in and out and Collins in and out, and that's obviously going to affect yards and targets per route run.
There's also like the home run derby effect where he was like the number 1 most efficient receiver last year. He's almost definitely going to be worse this year than he was last year.
Yeah. Sort by week. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, 3.23 yards per route run, surrounded by games 1.21, 1.3. I don't know. I keep on telling myself that he's going to get better. Like I feel like he should over time, like over the course of the year, get closer to what he was last year. I'm still hopeful that that's the case, and he's not getting, he's getting sub 30% total ownership. So I think he's a strong play. I think I missed your analysis there as I was looking up stats for Tank Dell. But how do you feel? Can you just give me a synopsis again of like 4% captain ownership, sub 30% total? Is that does that seem light to you, or do you think that's about right?
I think it seems a little bit light. I have optimal captain like 8%.
Okay.
Optimal flex 28. So I guess around the field at flex, I like him a little bit more at captain. Again, just I don't think he is necessarily, or he's almost definitely not the same receiver that he showed last year, just because it would be really, really hard to be that good. But he's still probably very good. Like the truth is probably somewhere between what he's done this year, because again, he's just been plagued by drops and Stroud missing him when he's wide open, and just a combination of kind of fluky stuff that over a larger sample corrects itself. And he's, again, probably not as good as he was last year. The truth's probably somewhere in the middle, which still makes him a very high upside play at sub 10% captain ownership on a slate where you don't have very many viable captain options.
Yep. So I think it looks great. And then so I think we're on the same page there. Like he's just a little bit under owned, doesn't project that well point per dollar as you see here, but ultimately probably a little bit under owned. And then it's kind of a mess because this is the first game that we have Nico Collins back. We can take a look at, so we have John Mechie projected for 3.8 fantasy points here. Robert Woods projected 2.6, Xavier Hutchinson 1.6. That's at fantasy points. And then we look at Roto Grinders. I just want to see if they are about the same. John Mechie projected for 3.3 fantasy points, Xavier Hutchinson 1.1, Robert Woods 1.44. So they're not really giving much of a role to any of these guys. Do you have any clear preference between? Actually, let's take a look at the ownership real quick, because that might affect things. Here, sorting by John Mechie projected for 8% ownership. Robert Woods just under 5%. Xavier Hutchinson 3%. In terms of route participation last week, it was still, I believe, Hutchinson leading the way in route participation. 79% route participation. John Mechie 63%. Robert Woods just 26%. But then we saw it was Mechie who had the big game last time out. I don't know. Do you have a clear preference between these Texans tertiary receivers?
Mechie's my preference just because I think he's like, obviously they're going to be impacted by Nico coming back because the two wide receiver sets are going to be Nico and Tank Dell. But Mechie's been running a higher percentage of routes in the slot than Hutchinson, and Diggs is their primary slot receiver. So those are the routes that I think are most available. And it hasn't been a massive gap. Like if you go back to week 6, which is when Nico got hurt. Obviously, Diggs was still in for a while. But Mechie's run 38 slot routes. Dell's run 37. Hutchinson's run 33. But of their total routes, 47% of Mechie's routes have been in the slot, only 29% of Hutchinson's. So they could just, kind of move Hutchinson inside and he's splitting with Mechie. And to some extent, I think that happens. But I do think Mechie's used more as a slot guy than Hutchinson is, which does put him a little bit ahead of Hutchinson for me. They are similarly priced. There is more ownership coming into Mechie, but I think basically that all of Mechie, Hutchinson, and Woods are under-owned at flex right now. Woods actually is sandwiched between Mechie and Hutchinson. 46% slot participation for him since Nico's injury. 47% for Mechie. So I think all of these guys are going a little bit under-owned, but Mechie is the one that I prefer. When you look at route participation last week, Woods was behind both Mechie and Hutchinson. Hutchinson ran 79% of routes, 63% for Mechie, 26% for Woods. So based on that, combined with where they typically run their routes, for me, it's Mechie 1, Hutchinson 2, Woods 3.
I think that sounds right to me. Like Mechie, he also just played really well last time out, so it would make sense. Like they played him a good amount. He played really well on the targets that he got in the last game, and he lines up at slot. So everything looks like it is Mechie as the probably the best wide receiver 3 of the group, and also getting just 8% projected ownership. So I think I agree with you that Mechie looks the best of the group. Probably all slightly under-owned, just given that it might still be a rotation.
And to your point too, like just from a talent standpoint, not that we necessarily know how talented these guys are, but Mechie was the 2nd round pick that, then unfortunately missed his rookie year. Like there's draft capital there. He was expected to be pretty good. Robert Woods is a dinosaur. And then Hutchinson, just doesn't have the same draft capital or anything as Mechie. So like the assumption right now should be that Mechie is the better receiver, best receiver of the 3.
Yeah. Okay.
And not EOM is right too. Like if Woods is on the field as a run blocker, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, true.
That's why I've had this debate on Twitter several times, but like, I really do not care about snap percentage. I care about
me neither. Yep. Yeah, no, that's why I've completely stopped looking at snap share for the most part. Like I'm just like, I always just refer to route participation. I think Fantasy Points does a great job, like because they have people that actually chart every single play of every single game. So I think that they have really accurate route participation relative to some other sites. That I typically just focus on the routes rather than the snaps. All right, let's move on to the other side of the game. CeeDee Lamb projecting for 16.2 fantasy points at Fantasy Points. At RotoGrinders, CeeDee Lamb projecting for 15.5 fantasy points, 36.5% projected ownership in the flex. At Captain, Lamb projected for just under 10% ownership. This is our second game with Cooper Rush starting for the Cowboys this year. Last week, he was targeted 9 times on 81.3% route participation. So pretty strong role still, like clearly the target hog that you want him to be still. I also took a note, Adam, in 2022, in those 5 games that Cooper Rush started early in the year, Lamb averaged 9.4 targets per game. So right in line with what he saw last week, and averaged 16.5 PPR fantasy points per game. So better than he saw last week. The Texans defense has also allowed the 9th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to wide receivers. So ultimately, we still expect him to get a pretty solid workload. They're probably going to have to pass to keep up with the Texans, but he's getting some ownership, 10%, like I said, at Captain, and then 36.5% at Flex. I don't know. So just under 50%. How do you feel about CeeDee Lamb today?
I think he's going a little under-owned at Captain, and it's disgusting, but I think it's just, at least with the way things are projected right now, the field probably moving a little bit too aggressively to the most logical game script where it's just ugly for Dallas. But if they're playing from behind, as long as it's, not by like 6 touchdowns or something, you're still expecting Lamb to get targeted a lot. He's still really, really good. Dallas also, we talked about maybe they run more with Rush. Maybe they just scheme more, short passes, get the ball in Lamb's hands. Like they've used him out of the backfield before too. Just getting the ball into your best player's hands more often and letting him do things. There's a lot of ways for him to end up getting there. And it's not 0% that Cooper Rush just plays decent and CeeDee Lamb catches a couple touchdowns. Like that can happen also. It's probably more likely to happen than it seems like the field's giving it credit for. So I do think he's going under-owned at Captain just from a talent standpoint. And obviously Dallas would like him to be very involved. It's just a matter of how much can Cooper Rush get him the ball.
Like he's the very clear wide receiver one here, if nothing else. And we just like going back to that 2022 game log in terms of PPR fantasy points. So in the first game with Rush starting 15.1, actually, I think he started that game. Might have been Dak started it and Rush came in later. But then the next two games with Cooper Rush at quarterback in 2022, this is PPR points, but 22.7 fantasy points and then 21.7. And then a big drop off down to 10.3, 12.7, 10.6. But we saw a couple games over 20 fantasy points with Cooper Rush playing the whole game for the Cowboys. So clearly can do well here.
He's the fourth highest projected guy on the slate. And I don't really think that there's much debate about that. Like, I think, like Mixon, Stroud, Collins, I think kind of all have to be ahead of him. And I don't think you can make a case for anybody else being higher.
Yeah. Alan asked whether his injury limits him. I'm not expecting it to. Like, it sounds like he's going to be good to go for this game. If he does play, I'm probably just playing it straight, like as though he's healthy.
That's generally what I do, unless we have like real reason to think that they're going to be limited. It's really tough to just play the guessing game of like, oh, this guy is hurt enough that he's going to play but be limited, and this guy is not, and whatever. Like, especially we're in week 11, most of these guys are hurt. It's just, and I assume they're going to play a normal amount.
Yep. All right. So behind CeeDee Lamb, we have Jalen Tolbert has the second best projection, 4,600 though. He's not getting, I guess he's getting 24% ownership now. So I think that's maybe come up a little bit from earlier. 24% in the flex for Jalen Tolbert at captain. We have Jalen Tolbert coming in at 3% ownership. What are you doing with Jalen Tolbert today?
He just kind of looks completely right to me. Field projected around 24, 25% total ownership, 21% at flex, 3 at captain. And that's pretty much exactly what I have. Should be the wide receiver 2 here. 4,600 is a reasonable price tag. Obviously has the quarterback issue, but looks perfectly fine at that price.
Yeah. Really strong route participation. Like like you said, I think pretty clearly the wide receiver 2 here. The role has been strong, decent targets. Looks about right to me. Also, behind Jalen Tolbert, we've got Jalen Brooks, Ryan Flournoy, Jonathan Mingo added to the mix. It's kind of a mess here in Dallas. Do you have, I guess we're going to read off the ownership. So Jalen Brooks is 2,000, projects the next best. Here, I'll pull up Roto Grinders. Going to sort by projection. So after Tolbert, they have Jalen Brooks, the next best, with a 4.5 projection at about 18% ownership. Kevontae Turpin after that with a projection just under 10% ownership. Ryan Flournoy, half a point projection. So now we're getting really, low down on the totem pole. Jonathan Mingo, not even a projection. What are you doing with the Dallas guys?
Mingo should have a projection, so that's going to throw things off too. I think the Dallas guys beyond Tolbert is a mess because we don't know how used Mingo is going to be. Logically, you would expect them to be trying to use him, considering what they gave up for him. Also made that case with Dotson earlier in the year, but even Philly is using Dotson. He just sucks and can't get open. So they should be trying to get Mingo out there. If you look at route participation last week, Mingo was inactive, but Brooks dropped off to 44% route participation. That was still higher than anybody other than Lamb, Ferguson, and Tolbert. Turpin dropped to 19%. Flournoy actually had increased to 19%. I assume that Mingo is taking routes from Turpin and Flournoy first, and that you probably have Brooks continue in that 40 to 50% range. So I think Brooks is the guy that I like third. I think that the problem is Turpin's 1,200 and Mingo is 3,200. I'm kind of intrigued by Mingo if the field doesn't play him, just because maybe he steps in as the wide receiver 3 right away. It's not like he has a huge barrier to entry there, but I assume he's the 4th guy from a playing time standpoint, but he's also expensive. So it's easier for Turpin to pay off his salary. So I think it's kind of like Brooks, either Turpin or Mingo, then the other one, then Flournoy for me.
That seems reasonable. It's tough with Mingo because I'm I don't think he's any good. So you're like he should have a projection, and my instinct is like, why? Like, why are they going to play Jonathan Mingo? And then I'm like, oh, well, they traded a fourth round pick for him.
Yeah.
So I think you're probably right that like
Yeah.
they are going to use Mingo, even if we don't think he's good. He should probably have a projection.
None of the people he's competing with are good either.
Also true. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Probably should have a projection. I think that, I think you summed it up pretty well. By tonight, when I do my show, I'll have updated ownership projections. It'll probably look a little bit better. So I don't think we need to go too much deeper in receiver. You already laid out your order preference. I will see if I agree later on once we get ownership projections, which obviously would affect your ranking also. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see there. Chris says, joining late, great call with Higgins last night, Neil. He was in first for 3.5 quarters and ended up min cashing. That is brutal. Yeah, the T Higgins call went well. It was very much a mixed bag for me yesterday. But yeah, T Higgins looked pretty awesome and did come in pretty low owned. All right, let's move on to tight ends. And we will start with, I'll start with the highest projected. Jake Ferguson, the highest projected of the tight ends. He's 5,800. He also has Cooper Rush passing to him. But maybe as a tight end, like maybe Cooper Rush focuses in on him. 28% projected ownership seems fine to me since he's only 5,800. And then at captain, Ferguson coming in at about 5% ownership. I don't have any real issue with those numbers, Adam. What are you getting to with Ferguson?
Yeah, I mean, I think they look fine. I'm right around the field there. Clearly, he's the tight end one. He's going to run more routes probably than everybody on the team, other than Lamb and maybe and probably Tolbert. Houston has been very good at limiting fantasy production to tight ends this year. They haven't been very good at limiting it to wide receivers. So from that standpoint, if they're going to kind of be forcing the ball to the outside more, that's not ideal for Ferguson. But should be running a lot of routes. He's not super expensive. He's fine.
Yep. Do you have any interest in the other tight ends for Dallas? Luke Schoonmaker, Brevin Spanford. They no longer have, what's the name of the guy that just went to the Chiefs? Peyton Hendershot is now on the Chiefs. So no Peyton Hendershot to worry about anymore. I don't know. Schoonmaker, Spanford, I think probably both just look fine, not like priorities.
Yeah, same. Like they're cheap backup tight ends.
Yeah.
From a route standpoint, Shoemaker, 12.5% route participation last week. Spanford was in 4.5%. Like, yeah.
Yeah. 2 total routes run last week for Spanford, 4 for Luke Schoonmaker. So they're very much the like backup tight end, maybe score the touchdown and you want him if they do, but not really strong plays. On the other side, we have Dalton Schultz projected for 7.2 fantasy points. What is his projected? That's kind of interesting to me. Dalton Schultz projected for 4% captain ownership. At flex, Dalton Schultz projected for 26% ownership. I actually have not gotten to look at schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed for tight ends yet. Looks like it is a bad matchup for Ferguson, bottom 5 there, and actually both tight ends bottom 7 for Dalton Schultz. I don't know. Those numbers are really intriguing to me for Dalton Schultz, Adam. How much of Schultz are you getting to?
21% flex optimal, 2% captain optimal. So pretty close to how I have the field projected. Like you said, Dallas has been a tough matchup so far for opposing tight ends, especially split out. Inline tight ends have actually been pretty neutral. I'm trying to get fantasy points to load, but it's frozen to see. So far this season, I got it. Schultz so far this year, 56% of his routes have been inline. Stover has run 74% of his inline. So that has, I guess like that 56% have been there for Schultz. That number certainly could have been a little bit lower. But at 5K, I think, again, he's just pretty efficiently owned.
It's funny. So I have lower own numbers and I was thinking higher own numbers. And I thought that they seemed light to me. So I don't know. He's sort of intriguing to me just from the standpoint of he's in the same role that he had last year, and he had better route participation and like target share last year without Diggs than he's had this year. But yeah, probably the ownership looks about right for Schultz in a not ideal matchup. Are you getting to any Stover?
probably just because he's cheap. I mean, I have him optimal like 6.5% of the time at 1,600, which is right around where I think the field is.
Yeah, I mean, decent route participation in recent weeks. You just look at the last 5 weeks for Cade Stover. It's 25% to 35% each of those weeks. 1 to 3 targets, not a huge role, but like as far as backup tight ends go, I think he looks pretty strong. Sorry, how much do you say you're getting to?
I have him optimal like 6% of the time.
Nice. Okay. We got a super chat from our Apple guy, Chris Williams. Always appreciate seeing Chris in chat. Says just showing some support to the two legends. Also just goes to show you how crazy showdowns can be, as last night, the two players who got multiple touchdowns, not one of them was in the winning lineup. Just great. Is that right? Man, I totally did not even. So
I didn't
Jamar
actually
Chase,
look what the winning lineup
Jamar Chase and J.K. Dobbins were the two that had multiple touchdowns, right? So that's kind of nuts. I didn't actually look at the winning lineup that was split 5 million ways. Didn't look closely at it. But that is kind of crazy. And obviously appreciate your support, Chris. As always, you are the man. All right.
Yeah, no, they weren't.
Yeah, that's kind of nuts.
Higgins captain, Burrow, Herbert, McConkey, Disley, Yoshivas.
Okay. So it was just like Higgins outscored them and
McConkey.
Burrow. Oh, McConkey got there in the end. Huh. And he was also cheaper. So that's really interesting. I wonder if anybody played the optimal. Maybe nobody played the optimal last night. I don't know. All right. Anything else at tight end?
No.
All right. And then defenses, kickers. We have Fairbairn coming in at 22% projected ownership. Texans defense at 19%. Cowboys defense at 16%. And who did I miss?
Texans defense. Or
oh,
Aubrey.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wasn't actually
Aubrey.
listening.
Obviously, I know that. Where is Aubrey? Aubrey at 19%. So they're all kind of getting 18 to 20% ish ownership. 18 to 22%. Wouldn't be that shocking to see the Texans defense actually end up significantly higher. I saw Cody Main had a tweet about like historically expensive defenses, how owned they get, and sounds like they always come in like under projected relative to ownership. I don't know. Do you have any notes on kickers defenses?
I think the Texans defense like obviously looks good, but I do think they're going over owned. Like I have them being optimal 16% of the time, which is high at 6,200. Like that's higher than you're usually going to get for a defense. But it makes sense, I think, too, for it to trend the way that you were saying Cody tweeted. Like if a defense is priced up like this, assuming it's not a complete misprice, it's because the very obvious first thing people think is like, how the hell is the other team going to score? And so I'm going to slam this defense in. So just from a narrative standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. So I do think they're going over owned. Like I think the price tag is warranted in that if they were a lot cheaper, they would just be like a slam dunk play. So I do think they're going over owned though. I think going to the Houston side or the Dallas side rather is fine. I think they're more neutrally owned. They are quite a bit cheaper. So I actually have their optimal rate slightly higher than Texas because of the salary. The kickers, I think, make sense. With Aubrey, you run into the issue of, is Dallas can be able to move the ball, but the other side of that is, can they move the ball just enough to get into 50-yard field goal range? And then Aubrey is really, really good. So I have both kickers showing up optimal 19 to 20% of the time. No huge opinions here, but I do think of the four, I think the Houston defense is likely to be the most overowned.
I'll just read off Cody's tweet from earlier at CMain7 on Twitter. Cody said, elevated tags on showdown defenses has hardly been a deterrent for the field. There have been 12 instances of defenses priced greater or equal to $6,000. They've averaged a projection of 8 fantasy points, 38.2% total ownership, and 11.3% captain ownership. It would not be shocking to see them come in mega overowned tonight. They obviously look great for all the reasons you mentioned, for all the reasons the field wants to get there. Like, yeah, they look good against Cooper Rush, but probably going to end up overowned.
And one other thing to point out defensively, and this goes to the question in chat about the lines. We talk about this a lot in classic slate, how like there's so much volatility in defense, in part because fantasy scoring isn't exactly in line with defenses preventing points. So if you can get a team that's going to get a defense that's going to get sacks and create pressure, that can be a lot better for like the expected outcome for the defense than just, I don't think this team's going to score a ton of points. Houston's offensive line this year has allowed the third highest pressure rate over expectation, according to fantasy points data. And Dallas's defensive line Dallas's defensive line has the fourth highest pressure rate over expectation this season. So it does set up as a pretty good matchup as far as pressure goes for Dallas's defensive line at a pretty cheap price tag.
Yeah, good call there. Yeah, that's one that's like, I don't usually dig too deep into the numbers for defenses, but that is worth looking at. Yeah, it looks like they're going a little bit on their own. Obviously, they're facing CJ Stroud, so it's like probably going to do better than the average quarterback against the pressure. But yeah, that's a good call out there. Okay, I think that does it. Do you have any other notes on the game, Adam?
Yeah. So one other thing is kind of, and somebody mentioned it in chat. I didn't catch who it was, but I think it's kind of shown throughout this show and the way that we've talked about it, as far as, like even bringing up blowout game scripts and all of that. I think it's very easy and it's very likely people are going to approach this game with like, Dallas has no shot. They have Cooper Rush, a quarterback, blah, blah, blah. This game has a 7.5 point spread. Like, it's pretty likely, I think, that the Dallas side ends up going under-owned in tournaments because it feels like such a easy spot for Houston. Like, it's not a massive spread here, and it's a pretty low total. Like, it's relatively likely that this game is just ugly in general, or Dallas hangs in there and kind of overperforms relative to how people are thinking about this game, I think.
Yep. I think you're right about that. I also just saw a couple of comments as I'm scrolling through. Apparently, I missed some chat, and I saw multiple people saying that they like Turpin on Standing Mass. Do I think we see any design plays for Turpin? Certainly could happen. I just want to point out that like I actually don't love Turpin. Just looking at look at the past 4 weeks, the trend in terms of route participation: 43%, 30%, 24%, 19%. Now they're adding Jonathan Mingo. Certainly like could get there, and they might design a random play to him, as they do sometimes with Turpin. But man, the role has not been not a promising trend there.
I would say I think it's likely he gets a designed play or two. I'm not sure he gets a play that isn't designed.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly what you can probably expect for Turpin. Like, he's not going to have much of a role, but yeah, when he's out there, they'll probably manufacture a couple touches for him. And he's fairly cheap, so obviously playable.
Yeah, and also for what it's worth, I had a really good prop betting weekend, but I got crushed on almost every money line bet that I made, and I do have Houston money line tonight, so it's another point in favor of Dallas overperforming.
Nice. Yeah, you were close to taking down a UFC contest, and then you were able to hedge it successfully, though, right? That worked out okay.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like with UFC DFS. The ideal is that you have the favorite going into the main event, and then you can just slam the underdog. I had the opposite, so I was able to get my buy-ins back just throwing $7,000 on John Jones. But yeah, it's the dream is when you have the favorite and you can just bet a bunch on the underdog.
Yeah, that would be the ideal, obviously. All right, Adam, you have an NBA show later today. Any other words?
Yeah, NBA show on the Endgame channel at 4:30. Gonna take a look at how I'm approaching DraftKings tournaments over there. So looking forward to that.
All right, check out Adam there, of course. You can find links for, actually, I think we have links. We have links at least for Adam's Dub Club in the description. You could also check out Endgame Syndicate. A lot of great stuff there. Make sure you're subscribed to the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel. I will be back tonight about 85 minutes prior to lock to break down this game once again when we have better ownership projections, inactives, and such. So I'll be back here on the Flannelverse YouTube channel. You can find me tonight. Thank you all very much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe. All of that is very much appreciated. I will catch you later tonight. And of course, check out Adam if you're playing NBA DFS tonight.